This is Mac Payne here with episode 1771 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, I'm going to be joined by Vietnam veteran John Shoemaker, who is going to tell us a very touching story about hardship, pain, and agony. As you listen to John's story, I advise you to have a box of Kleenex nearby because it just might bring tears. It's a tearjerker. I'll warn you up front. Back in episode 1767, John talked about a battle on the Ho Chi Minh Trail back in the summer of 1970 when he was a platoon leader with B Company 2nd of the 1st Infantry, 196th Infantry Brigade of the Americal Division. In that battle, he lost a very good man. His name was Larry Gatliff. It was a terrible thing. It always seems like the people you miss the most are the ones you lose. In this episode, John's going to follow up that story with what happened when he reached out to contact Larry's family. It is an amazing story. Why they haven't made a movie out of it, I don't know. Maybe the people out in Hollywood aren't aware of it. But I feel it would make a great story. John has agreed to come on this podcast and share this story with us. As he tells his story, you'll be able to hear the emotion and why he was affected so much by it. And you will be too. I can tell you right now, without giving away everything, it does end on an up note. Right now, sit back, relax, make sure that box of Kleenex tissues is nearby, and listen to John Shoemaker tell his story. John, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for sharing this heart-rending story with us.
Thank you, Mac. I really appreciate it. What I'm going to do in this podcast is continue on from the last one, which involved the ambush on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. As those who listened would know, I anticipated an ambush. I felt it. I just had this awful feeling that once we had broken through from thick jungle in the mountains south of Cam Duck on the Laotian border, knowing that the enemy was all around us, and after we had attacked a hill and killed a number of the NVA, and after an engagement that involved everything from artillery to Cobra gunships, and then a ground attack. In the following days, we had to continue to search the area. It was all about find the enemy, make contact, and take them out. Well, when we broke onto the trail, we started up this hill. I put a squad to my right flank, and the hill dropped steeply off to our left, where to my right it continued up, but not as steeply. It was more of a hill. As we went up that hill, two of NVA soldiers were laying at the top on the road itself. They saw that I had a German Shepherd scout dog that was leading my line of march, single file, as we approached the top of the hill. I believe today that that German Shepherd was my shepherd that guided me to that day. Unfortunately, when they opened up with their machine gun fire, the dog was severely wounded, jumped off to one side, and the scout dog handler was shot in both legs. And Larry Gatliff, he's the man I'm going to talk about today. Larry Gatliff. He was fairly new. I don't even know if he graduated from high school. He came from Lebanon, Oregon, and was just a real nice kid, 19, and full of wonder as to what was going on in the world. He'd never been on a plane before, never traveled outside of Oregon. And so everything was new to him, and all his senses were exploding with new experiences. In any event, as soon as the NVA had opened up on us, he took a round right to his forehead. He fell backwards and landed backwards with his head nearly touching mine. I could see that he took a round right through his forehead and out the back. It was a catastrophic wound. Then the follow-up, of course, was trying to avoid concentrating on that so much and returning fire and And then as the NBA tried to end run us, my squad took out the NBA. As an aside, what I didn't mention is when we left grenades under the bodies of the two NBA soldiers. And sure enough, later that night, the explosions indicated that the enemy was going to suffer some more. When we loaded Larry onto the chair of the medevac, I'm sure it was a Rattler Huey from the battalion that picked up Larry. As he was going up the chair, the image of it today still sticks with me as he was going through the triple canopy jungle. I couldn't even see the helicopter. The pilot had dropped the basket down through more than 100 feet to get to us. I said that I would never forget. Well, years later, after the war is over and I'm into my career, and all of a sudden I see this movie called Platoon. Now, I have to admit, I went with my son to see the movie, and there were some scenes where my knees were shaking, and I was dodging and weaving in the seat in the movie theater, doing some of the ambushes, some of the scenes that were pretty well done, almost too realistic, although the overall movie itself was pretty Hollywood dramatic. The fact is, it was a big influence on me. So I started thinking about Larry again. I said, geez, maybe I should call, because I then believed that there was no way this could be an open casket. So I wondered what the parents would think. All I knew, going to the wall a couple of times, that Larry came from Lebanon, Oregon. So what did I do? I called information. I started searching. I found one name, Gatliff, in Lebanon. So I said, well, what are the chances of that? So I just called the number out of the blue. And when the lady answered, I tried to explain who I was, and I was looking for the parents of Larry Gatliff. She hung up on me. I was kind of surprised. I tried calling back, and there was no answer. So I waited a day or two, and I called the same number again. This woman was really upset that I was calling, and I said, whoa, wait a minute. I was a lieutenant in Vietnam, and Larry was one of my soldiers. It took a while for me to convince her that I was legitimate. Well, it turns out that the family had gotten so many calls from idiots who were happy that Larry was killed, that the war was wrong, that the baby killers and all this other crap. And they were really suffering from this attitude. And of course, this is all part of the whole Vietnam era mess, the lack of support and the attitudes of idiots that are still around today. That's what we see in the streets, even today, with people spouting off just really ugly things. In any event, she said she'll think about it. I waited another day or two. This was over the course of a week, and I called her back, and it turns out that by chance I had contacted the sister-in-law of Larry Gatliff. Apparently, she had married, and I didn't even know Larry had a brother. Once I went through the details of the unit, she verified that I came from that unit, 2nd of the 1st, 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company, 1970, Marical Division, all of that. She listened. And I tried to explain what happened and what was going on, and I thought that I should share this with the family because I considered Larry a solid, great soldier. As I had said before, when people were tired and pissed, hated what was going on, he'd come over at the end of the day and he'd help the guy who was moaning and groaning and dig his foxhole for him. I mean, the guy was just superb. Then I found out that she said, well, I'm so glad you got a hold of me and not his father, who at the time was in the hospital. He had become an alcoholic. Things did not go well for the father. He developed heart problems and was diabetic and was in the hospital. And she felt that if I had got a hold of him, he probably would have had a heart attack and died. Then she told me the story of Larry's mother. Well, it turns out war has an incredible impact way beyond years, beyond the war itself. It's not just the wounded that come back, PTSD and with lost limbs and all of the accommodations that have to be made in their lives for the rest of their lives. It's also the families of those who came back wounded, but also the families of those where they came back in a box. In this case, Larry's parents couldn't deal with it. They just were so distraught. They ended up getting divorced. The mother, Edith Gatliff, went back to her maiden name, Edith Albrightson. She was not going to believe that her son was killed in Vietnam. In fact, she believed that he was, in fact, I made some notes here, that he was still alive, that he was probably in prison somewhere, that he was possibly maimed or blind or something else, that he felt ashamed and didn't want to come home. This is what she told me. I wrote it in my notes. She had faith that he was still alive, but nobody in the family believed it. She ended up being an outcast. And so for all the years since, now this is in the mid-1980s, okay, this is like 15 years later, she was an outcast from the Gatliff family. She ended up marrying again in the woods of Lebanon, Oregon, and I believe did not go well. I don't know the whole story about that marriage, but in any event, when I did call, the sister-in-law coordinated this so that I could call and talk to Edith, Larry's mother. I explained who I was. I tried to explain what happened, how great Larry was as a soldier, how much respect I had for him, to give him the honor he deserved and make her feel that her son was a hero. She was crying on the phone. I had tears running down my own face as I'm trying to explain all of this. She really felt as though she admitted that I just didn't believe he was killed and that she wanted to have closure on this, and it entirely changed her spirit, her attitude. I found out later from the sister-in-law that she was a different woman in many ways. So I decided I got to do something more. I was not a wealthy man at the time. I wanted to bring Edith to Washington, D.C. to the wall. I wanted her to see the wall. Turns out that, like Larry, she had really never been outside of Oregon her whole life. And so I said, I'll arrange to bring her to Washington, D.C. during a Memorial Day celebration at the wall. And I would say celebration, a memorial service at the wall. Edith agreed that she would come, but that she didn't have any money to do it. So I found a benefactor, and with the support of the Vietnam Veterans of Massachusetts and a gentleman by the name of Robert Jeffrey, a Boston area, very successful businessman who never served but always felt guilty that he did not serve. We were about the same age, but he found a way not to go in. And instead, this was something that he wanted to do. So he picked up the tab, but we had to do it under the Vietnam Veterans auspices. And I found out that Larry had a half-sister. She was about 10 or 12 years old at the time. So I said, bring her. And so my wife and I went to Washington, D.C. We met Edith and the daughter, Diane, at the airport. I had arranged for a white limo pick us up and bring us to a hotel, 4-star hotel, all compliments of the benefactor and the Vietnam veterans. What's kind of unique is that in Christmas of 1970, I was able to take much of my company from Hawk Hill to Da Nang to see Bob Hope at Christmas. It was quite an event. It was very amazing that I could be part of something like that, since a lot of the infantry were in the field. But at that point, I was able to do it and brought about 70 of my soldiers from the headquarters company of the battalion. In any event, on this day, 1987, and in fact, I said it was Memorial Day. It was actually Veterans Day, 1987, when Larry, and sister of Larry held hands with my wife and me, and we listened to the ceremonial speeches at the wall. Well, it turns out that Bob Hope was there, along with a number of other dignitaries. They were all speaking. Now, at the same time, on that particular day, I'm going to read from an article that was published in a number of magazines. On that particular day, a howling blizzard of snow pounded the gathering that came to make tribute. And there were a couple hundred there, including generals, including celebrities, led by Bob Hope in a recognition. And it snowed over a foot. It was an amazing event, but it seemed appropriate in terms of the hardship. It was fitting to see Bob Hope, for sure. His presence helped to remind us of courage unfazed by the adversity of war and weather. Following what has become a standard practice, I lifted up Larry's sister so that she could rub her fingers across Larry's name. Bowing my head, I whispered to her, "We remember you, Larry." Tears streamed from 1,000 eyes on that day. Looking over my shoulder as we walked up the west wall to leave, I felt a chill streak up my spine as my eyes froze on another name that I just happened to see on that black marble. It was that of John Shoemaker. Apparently he was a whole nother story, another time. But the coincidence, I have to admit, shook me up. In this article, I continue the summary by saying that the weather cleared the next day. It revealed a deep blue sky and a brilliant sun. And during the flight home to Boston, I tried to put things in perspective. I thought about what a great country this is, wondered if most Americans really appreciate what we have here in this country. Do we understand how dangerous this world is and how cheaply life is regarded by so many on this planet? Peace is expensive, and no one knows better than those who volunteered to pay the price. So I wrote that in September of 1987. I've lost track of Edith and Diane over the time, but out of the blue, about another 7-8 years later, which would make Edith's daughter, Larry's sister, Diane, about 18, 19 years old, she called me out of the blue and said, "By the way, I just wanted you to know, Mr. Shoemaker, that I joined the Army to carry on for my half-brother the legacy of what he did and what he sacrificed." I just thought that was amazing. I was really touched by it. I know that she was. It's a memory that she'll never forget. Having never been out of Oregon and having gone to Washington, D.C., and I had arranged for them to have a tour of the city, to see the government buildings, the Capitol building, all the great sites that you can see in a couple of days before they had to go home. Treated them first class all the way. And that was the best that I could do for Larry and his memory. So that gives you a feeling for the hardship, the pain, the agony of those families that are changed forever when a son or daughter is lost in war. Regardless of the war, they will not recover in their lifetime. And it comes at a time when most people today don't know what a Gold Star mother or a Gold Star father is. Gold Stars are really special, and I can only pray that they find some peace, and that in this case with Larry Gatliff, Private Larry Gatliff at the time, a special soldier who gave his life on one day in 1970, that he is remembered and honored. So that's my story for this time, this day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John Shoemaker, for telling us that touching story about one of your fallen soldiers, Larry Gatliff, and the hardship, pain, and agony that his passing brought to his family. The story did end up on a positive note when you told us about Larry's younger sister, Diane. joining the Army to honor the memory of her brother. That was a wonderful story that not only honored the memory of one soldier, Larry Gatliff, but I believe it honored the memory of all those who gave their life in Vietnam and whose name is on the wall in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for sharing your story with us. It was a wonderful thing. With that, this is Mac Payne closing out episode 1771 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these stories. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.